Now, one of the very first problems that needed to be addressed is, what does the spaceship look like? Roddenberry knew one thing immediately. It wasn't going to look like any of the stereotypical spaceships featured in movies and television up to that time. No rockets, no flying saucers, and absolutely no flaming exhausts. Now, using those constraints, the task fell to one Matt Jefferies to design a spaceship that would look like a true spaceship, but could not look like any spaceships that had come before. Over the next few weeks, Matt would present Gene with sketches. Gene would tell him what he liked and what he didn't like about each design. Little by little, a composite design began to form. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the worldwide debut of the Starship Enterprise. Now, before we move on, I want to take the moment to point out a few items from this signed sketch all the way back in 1964. Many folks have asked about the origin of the registry numbers. The lower left-hand corner tells us in Matt's own handwriting that 17 represented a sequential number used by Starfleet for each new ship. Also, take a look at this. Note that the concept of potential refits were considered all the way back in 1965 when he made his note about NCC 1701A. Now, at the very end of this process, the elegant and unique design that would enthrall viewers for decades began to come into view. These last two color drawings show the top and lateral elevations of the proposed model. Also note here that the name in this last drawing is SS Enterprise. Also of note is the notation about the paired power units. An interesting anecdote of Star Trek history is that Matt never used the word nacelle for these. He would refer to them as power units during the original series, and then later as power pods all the way up through Star Trek the Motion Picture. To obtain the final sign off from Roddenberry, Matt created a 4-inch model in balsa wood and showed it to Gene. Now, unfortunately, this 4-inch model was lost to time as the decades passed. I've never been able to find any specific evidence or references on what happened to the model. There are lots of urban legends, but nothing you can quite nail down. With the new design approved, the Howard Anderson Company then subcontracted to Richard C. Datin the order to build two models of the Enterprise. Now, Datin would receive the original blue lines from Matt, dated November 7th, 1964. Using them, he would begin construction of the 33-inch reference model. Excuse me, Jim, did you mean to say blueprints were used in the construction? Funny you should ask. Longtime viewers of the channel will be familiar with my fascination with things my mother called useless knowledge. It is my uncanny ability to remember things like who was the only US president to be single, while still not being able to tell you what it was I ate for dinner last night. By the way, the president was James A. Buchanan. He was the president before Abraham Lincoln. The beginnings of the mid 1970s brought us the Star Trek Starfleet Technical Manual and the Star Trek blueprints, serving as a template that everything would similarly follow afterwards. Almost every blueprint you have ever seen associated with Star Trek isn't really a blueprint. In reality, the drawings are what the architectural world calls blue lines. The reason is because they are printed on white backgrounds, whereas blueprints are printed appropriately on, guess what? A blue background. Instead, we will show you an actual set of real Star Trek blueprints and a sample of one of the many blueprints from the TV show Mythbusters. And now we'll return you to your regular scheduled programming. So meanwhile, back at the Dayton household, Richard used the drawings that Matt had provided of the 33-inch model. Now, over the years, there have been many photos of drawings and blueprints published that were purported to be the final set used by Dayton for the construction. Richard Dayton mentions that the ones specifically in the Star Trek sketchbook, as well as the ones mentioned in Inside Star Trek, are not the actual set. Now, how can he be sure of this? Simple. He had the only set used in the construction of the models in personal possession all of these years. Paul Newett was kind enough to provide this photo of Dayton and the drawings, which were taken during a visit with Dayton. In the meantime, Dayton reached out and subcontracted the model production shop to build what he referred to as the 4 times model. Just 2 weeks after being given the drawings, Dayton delivered the very first studio model ever built of the Starship Enterprise. Somewhere around mid November, measuring at 33 inches, It was made almost entirely from solid wood. Now, by this point, work hadn't even begun on the larger model, so Gene made the decision to actually use the smaller model for filming as it was ready far earlier than the larger model. Saving the larger model for a single shot, he quickly gave a list of changes that he wanted made in the meantime. Among these, Gene asked Datin to paint windows on the surface of the models. Now, about a month later in mid December, Dayton delivered the updated small model to Gene, and these two shots were taken on the old 40 acres lot where they were actually filming the cage. In the first picture, you see Gene examining the model while Richard Dayton holds it. Now, never one to miss a publicity shot, Gene had another photo taken with the star of the pilot, Jeffrey Hunter, holding the model for Roddenberry to inspect. The work on the larger model begins on December 8, 1964. Now, amazingly, this is the only known photo depicting the actual construction of the model. Originally part of a magazine article, it shows Mel Keys and Vernon Sion creating the plaster molds, which would then be used to create the saucer section for the model. On December 29th, 1964, about a week after all shooting had been completed, the 11-foot model was delivered to the Howard A. Anderson studio at Desilu. Now, amazingly enough, the builders decided to take a few photos of the model as they offloaded it into the streets at the Desilu location. None of these men would ever have guessed that the photos they were taking that day would become world famous over the next 50 years. Please remember that at this point, Richard Dayton believed he had completed both models. He was unaware of any changes that Gene would be asking him to do shortly. As far as Dayton was concerned, they were locked and loaded, and he was moving on to the next thing. So